everybody. This is the fifth episode of our podcast called Geofinance. Today, as usual, Ivan and Dragan will be with you. Hello, Ivan. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you.
You're welcome. So, let us discuss something that is always actual. Let us discuss something about the price of oil and volatility in this market that could inflict other markets. Tell us, Ivan, what is going on with the price of oil and what can we expect?
Well, we really have to look at the past month and a half to see what's happening because when the virus epidemic broke out, and especially as it was spreading around the world, demand for oil dropped. And that could be seen in the price because the price of oil started going down. And that was all exacerbated in March because on March 8th, I think, there was a meeting, an OPEC Plus meeting, and Saudi Arabia was asking Russia to cut oil production, cut it further, because previously they had agreed to cut oil production to a certain level to maintain a floor on the market. And the Saudis wanted to cut further, and the Russians said, how about we don't cut yet? Let's just wait for another month, see what happens, and then we can cut. And MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he was not happy with that response, and he wanted to get back at Russia by increasing production and by cutting oil prices. So he cut prices effectively for customers, and he was followed also by other OPEC member states, including the UAE and Kuwait and Iraq. So that dramatically impacted the oil market, and the price of oil dropped by a lot, by over 30%.
Okay. OPEC Plus meeting should be held tomorrow. It was supposed to be held like on the 6th of April, but it had been rescheduled. And there are some speculations that Riyadh would threat to Russia to decrease further the most of it, the production of this important resource. What do you think about that? Can someone actually threat Russia in this aspect?
No, that is just ridiculous. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Russia is a real country. Russia is not just an oil cushion, for lack of a better word, because Saudi Arabia has only one export, and that is oil. Russia is a large economy, has a large population, produces all sorts of things, exports all sorts of things. Russia is a huge food exporter. Russia has minerals. Russia has natural gas. Russia has all sorts of stuff. Saudi Arabia has only one item, oil. And so Saudi Arabia really is not in a position to threaten anyone, especially not Russia.
Especially not Russia.
I think that this is not just Saudi Arabia versus Russia thing. This actually includes the United States, because the United States has so far been the biggest loser from this oil price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, and specifically shale oil producers in the US. They were impacted very, very much by this, because you have to remember that both Russia and Saudi Arabia have relatively easily available oil. So they just stick a tube into the ground and they start pumping, and it goes straight out. And in the US, the shale fields, the Bakken fields, other fields, it has to be fractured. So oil fracturing with chemicals, it's very difficult to get that oil. And by default, that oil is much more expensive. So I don't remember the exact manufacturer names, but which company has which break-even price. But for most companies, it's about $45 or above per barrel to keep them afloat. And for Saudi Arabia and Russia, it's much lower. So for Russia, this cost is less than $20 per barrel. For Saudi Arabia, it's even lower. But Saudi Arabia has other issues that that make it very vulnerable to low oil prices.
Okay. So we mentioned Russia. You said that Russia has managed to diversify its economy during the embargo and during the crisis that they had. Do you think that the other oil producers, if this situation should last, can do something about diversifying its economies, or do you think that they're all stuck being like only oil exporters?
Well, it's not in the case. I have to start with this. In the case of Russia, it's not so much diversification because Russia has always been a large producer of everything else. It's just that its economy, its budget depended a lot on oil, and that dependency has been reduced. That's very important to note
Which is
because
good.
which is good for Russia. Yeah, this is awesome because if half of your budget depends on oil, then you are in a bind here. But if oil is maybe 10-15% of your budget, then you'll be fine. I mean, even without that income, sure, the budget is going to contract, but it's still much better than some other countries. And in Saudi Arabia, the problem is that everything depends on oil. So oil income is used to fill the budget, and the country's budget is completely dependent on oil. So yes, it's much cheaper to pump oil in Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia actually requires oil to be above $80 per barrel, so if it wants to balance its budget, and that
Okay.
is a main point here because Saudi Arabia is a country completely dependent on oil, and if oil is below, say, 65, 70 for a long time, Saudi Arabia will not be able to withstand that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, other countries will be affected. I mean, already they are affected. Norway, for example, is the largest European producer of oil. It's affected. Other countries, other OPEC oil producers are affected. Venezuela is very deeply affected by this. And yeah, other countries will be too.
Interesting. Do you think that this oil price crisis, can spill into other aspects of living, such as geopolitical tensions, regional issues, spurring of violence, perhaps, in the region, in the Middle East, so to speak?
Realistically, yes, there is potential for that because as I said in the last episode, there is a lot of potential for instability in the Middle East because both of the disease and due to other issues, this is one of those issues. So you see, OPEC members in the Middle East, a lot of them depend on oil, and Iraq, Iran, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these countries depend a lot on oil. So there is a lot of potential for regimes to fall, and these are not democratically elected regimes. So if there's a revolution, of course, these regimes can be toppled. But I actually think in this current situation that the United States and Russia seem to have an agreement. I would I think that is the case now because I know that Trump and Putin had a few conversations over the past few days, mostly about oil, and I think they're going to try to squeeze MBS to cut production. That's really the only way to go forward. Because
Do,
if I think that the deal would be for everyone to cut production. If Russia agrees to cut production, it will never agree to cut production if the U.S. and Saudi Arabia don't cut production as well. So from Russia's perspective, either everyone cuts production or nobody cuts production.
what could be the reason of cooperation between the United States and Russia to act, so to speak, against the interests of Saudi Arabia? What do you think? Is it like some kind of policy, or is it something bigger than the short-term proposals that they could manage?
Well, for now, it's mostly economic because the United States, like I said, U.S. producers depend on a high oil price, and so unless oil goes up to 45, $50 a barrel, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. There's going to be a lot less investment in this field, and also the U.S. sees that as a national security issue because the United States would like to be self-sufficient in oil production. Countries don't really like to depend on other countries for essential resources such as oil.
Yes.
So if Saudi Arabia, starts to, for example, we all remember the 1970s oil embargo and the high oil prices.
Yes.
That could happen again, and the United States does not want to be in that position again. The US wants to be in a position where it can manage its own oil supplies, where it can affect the price of oil.
But could it happen again? Can we like envision the world where the oil is not that important? Is it possible that the world can function like a bit different than in 1970?
It's possible, but not in a short term, because I know that a lot of people are banking on green technology, renewable technologies, solar, wind power, all of that. It's not going to happen for a while. I would say at least a couple of decades. We will still be dependent on oil.
Couple of decades?
For a few more
Given
decades, we will be.
given the circumstances, sounds like a very long period.
And if the oil prices remain low, it might be even longer, because you have to go through a cost benefit analysis for everything, right? So you can buy an electric car for $100,000, or you can buy a cheap gasoline car. If oil costs $1.50 a gallon, then that is a much better proposition, because you're going to get a lot of driving for a lot less money than if you buy a Tesla, for example.
Okay.
And the same goes for industry. I mean, industry is even more dependent on oil than people can switch to electric vehicles, but industry in most cases can't really switch. Those technologies have not been invented yet. So
Okay.
it's going to take even more time. Also, the airlines spend like 10-15% of all oil. And we don't have electric turbines, electric batteries that can fuel planes for a long time. That's just, we don't have that technology yet, and we're probably not going to have it for at least a few more decades.
Okay.
Industry and consumers are all dependent on oil.
Well, many people are discussing the circumstances and the consequences of so-called the fourth industrial revolution, speaking about many new and inventive technologies. But the things that you just mentioned remind me a lot about the presentation of economist Jeremy Rifkin, who is often arguing that despite everything, we are still currently living in the era of the second industrial revolution, and that we are really pretty much dependent on technologies and on the resources that are originating from that period. So when you say like a couple of decades, and we are currently living in one very specific crisis, so to speak, with unpredictable consequences and developments, it may sound a little bit pessimistic. Or what can you say on this? Do you think that despite all the fuzz about the fourth industrial revolution and many, many different things that we can currently witness, we are still locked in developments and technologies that are like being developed for like more than 100 years ago?
Well, technology has changed quite a bit in the past 100 years. And so I think it's disingenuous to say that we're still using technology from the second industrial revolution. That's the first point. The second point is some countries, wealthy countries, may have the option of switching to green technologies. Famously, Greta Thunberg said that we should stop using fossil fuels today. We should use green technologies, etc. Maybe for Sweden that is an option, but for a lot of the developing world, countries in Africa and Asia, that is just not an option. And if you try to switch off to ban the use of fossil fuels today, that would cause millions of deaths. That would force billions of people to continue living in poverty for the foreseeable future. That is just, I think that is, first of all, unfair. And also, it's very hypocritical for someone to say that, oh, because we already went through this process, we already became advanced enough to not need fossil fuels anymore, so now let's ban fossil fuels for everyone. I think, first of all, that's not, it can't happen. I don't see how that can happen. And I don't think it should happen, because obviously people will always try to find the cheapest, the easiest way to do something. And currently that is fossil fuels. And I think again, for the foreseeable future, for the next couple of decades, it will remain fossil fuels. What happens, I don't know what the world of 2050 will be like. It's very hard to predict these things. But the world of 2030, I can see that we will still be using fossil fuels.
That's in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
Okay, so within this crisis, it's pretty challenging to predict anything, but okay, this is like the reasonable line of thought.
But I mean,
So,
even within this crisis, we can say, oh, look, the use of fossil fuels is down. And you look at satellite pictures and you say, oh, look at the pollution over China, it's way down. Pollution over Italy is way down. The canals of Venice are now, the water is clear. Yeah, that's
okay,
all true. But this
yes,
situation is unsustainable. This is not something that we can keep doing. I mean, this lockdown is of it cannot go on forever. It can go on for a few months, maybe.
maybe
But
yes,
but people don't, people who are unemployed, people who have no job, no food, no money, what are they going to do? I mean, they can't stay locked up effectively in their homes forever. They have to do something. They have to make money. And yeah, in the US, the stimulus, there's a proposal obviously for people to receive money from the government, but first of all, that I don't think that's a good idea. And secondly, most countries won't do that. So even if in the US or in some wealthier countries there are government programs to keep people at home, most of the world won't have that. Most of the world will have, you will be forced to go to do something with your skills and your time in order to make money to survive. No
that's
one's going to
true.
help you.
That's true. But I think, yes, definitely the developing countries are going to be hit hardest in this specific time. So, what do you think that might happen in 3 months' time? Do you think that this lockdown would be eased a bit in developed world, and that the developing countries would follow suit?
I think that over time the restrictions will be eased and eventually eliminated, hopefully within a few months. And I think that that's gonna have a positive effect on the price of oil, on the price of energy in general. I think that within 6 months, I would be shocked if oil remained at the $20, $25 level.
What do you predict?
I predict moderate growth. So I'm not predicting $100 oil. I'm predicting 30, 35 maybe by the end of the year, because currently there's a glut. Everyone has produced as much as they could, and storage facilities are full. So even if production is diminished, it's still going to take time for all of the stored oil to be used up, all of the stored gas to be used up. So it's going to take a while for the price of oil to get back to normal. But I mean, oil futures price that in, so I'm not expecting a huge rise. I mean, I really don't expect oil above 40 by the end of the year, but it can't possibly stay in the 20-ish range because that's unsustainable for everyone.
Definitely. Good. I think that we might conclude this episode by this prediction. So even I would like to say one big thank you. We still have to decide on the next topic, but it will come relatively soon. Therefore, dear listeners and everyone else, thank you for being with us today, and even hope to speak soon with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you and see ya. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.